In her 73 years old, Pat Benatar is still remembered as one of the greatest female voices in the history of American rock. The person who shaped the sound and image of an entire era. She was not only a successful singer, but also a cultural icon when she became one of the first female artists to dominate the MTV era with iconic music videos like Love is a Battlefield. Throughout a career spanning more than 4 decades, Pat Benatar won 4 consecutive Grammy Awards from 1980 to 1983, a rare achievement that proves her tremendous influence and astonishing consistency in the harsh music industry. Albums like Crimes of Passion and Precious Time not only reached high positions on the Billboard charts, but also sold millions of copies worldwide, helping push her total sales past the 35 million records mark. Songs like Hit Me With Your Best Shot, We Belong, or Heartbreaker were not just hits, but have become part of the collective memory of America. In 2022, she was officially inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a belated but well-deserved recognition for her irreplaceable contributions to popular music. But behind all those achievements was a journey that was never easy. A long battle that few people saw. To stand firm in a world where women were often undervalued in rock, she had to constantly prove herself, not only with her voice, but with her endurance and iron discipline. The years of continuous touring, the pressure to maintain a strong image and never be allowed to show weakness, wore down not only her body but also her spirit. There were times when she had to choose between continuing to chase the stage lights or stopping to hold on to what belonged to her family. And every choice came with its own price. She did not collapse in front of the public, but that did not mean she had never felt tired, never doubted, never felt she was gradually losing important parts of herself. It was in that silence, in those moments no one saw, that her will was formed, a will that was not loud, not showy, but strong enough to keep her moving forward, even when the road ahead was no longer as clear as before. Before we dive deeper into the story behind that voice, please hit like and leave a heart as a quiet way to acknowledge what she has endured without ever saying it out loud. And if you believe there are people who are stronger than they appear, please subscribe to the channel to explore together the journey that the stage lights have never fully told. Pat Benatar's childhood was not marked by noisy upheavals or easily visible wounds, but it was built in a space where everything had to be right, had to be proper, had to fit within the framework that adults had drawn out in advance. Growing up in New York, in a disciplined, working-class family, she was taught to be obedient, to be hard-working, to become a girl that society could accept, a stable life, a safe career, a path without risks. No one told her that she could live differently, and no one asked who she really wanted to become. Those expectations did not come from harshness, but from love colored with control, where safety was always placed above personal desire. And that created a paradox. She did not lack love, but she lacked the freedom to be herself. From very early on, Pat was exposed to classical music, a world where every note had to be precise, every emotion had to be controlled. She learned to sing correctly, to sing properly, to sing according to what was taught, but not to sing according to what she felt. Music, which should have been a place for people to be liberated, instead became another form of discipline. She stood on small stages, singing pre-selected songs, receiving praise for her perfection, but deep inside, something had never been touched. No one realized that behind that precise voice was a girl who was gradually learning to hide the truest parts of herself, because they did not fit what others expected. At school, she was the model of diligence and compliance, but that did not bring her a sense of belonging. The days passed in repetition, where everything seemed predetermined, where every choice pointed toward a correct but unfamiliar future. She did not rebel, did not resist, did not do anything wrong. And that very thing made her gradually disappear inside her own life. There were emotions she did not know how to name, thoughts she could not speak out because there was no space for them to exist. Everything had to be neat, had to be reasonable, had to be acceptable, except her true self. But then, amid all those frameworks, music still quietly existed as the only escape, not the official lessons, not the arranged performances, but very small, very personal moments. When she was alone, when no one was watching, when she could sing the way she wanted, without needing to be correct, without needing to be perfect. In those moments, her voice became different, rougher, stronger, truer. It was no longer the voice of a good student, but the voice of a person trying to find herself again. She did not know that what was forming inside her would one day break everything that had been built. She did not know that the repression did not disappear, but only accumulated, waiting for a moment to explode. But she felt one thing very clearly, even though she could not yet name it. If she continued to live like this, she would become someone perfect in the eyes of others, but a stranger to herself. And that fear, not the fear of failure, but the fear of losing herself, began to grow with each passing year. Quietly, persistently, like a small crack that no one saw but enough to change an entire life later. Then came a time when the choices were no longer questions, but became obligations. Pat Benatar stepped onto the path that everyone believed was the right one for her. She studied medicine, a decision that sounded solid, reasonable, and safe enough to reassure her family. It was the path of stability, of a guaranteed future, of a life where everything could be predicted. No more uncertain notes, no more uncontrollable emotions, only books, classrooms, and clear goals. To outsiders, it was a step forward, but to her, it felt like a door quietly closing, silent and without noise, but enough to block the part of her that she had never dared to live truly. During that time, she met Dennis Benatar, a man who represented exactly the life she was stepping into, stable, orderly, and without major disruptions. They got married when she was still very young, like a natural next step on the path that had already been laid out. A home, a marriage, a clear future, all the things that society considered success gradually appeared in her life. But amid all of that, there was a void she could not fill, a nagging feeling she could not explain. Everything was right, but nothing truly belonged to her. The days passed in a rhythm that repeated itself to the point of becoming almost invisible. Mornings began with responsibilities, afternoons ended with exhaustion, and evenings closed in silence. Nothing was wrong, but nothing made her feel alive either. She did what she was supposed to do, said what she was supposed to say, and became the person everyone expected her to become. And little by little, not through big events, but through the steady repetition of identical days, she began to feel herself disappearing. There were moments when she stood alone and wondered, was this all there was? It was not a question about success or failure, but about existence itself. She did not suffer in a way others could see, but she was not happy in a way others could feel either. It was a quieter, deeper state, when a person continued to live but was no longer truly present in her own life. And then, on those rare nights when she stepped out of that familiar space, something different began to emerge. Small performances, dimly lit bars with thick air, where no one demanded that she be perfect. There, she did not need to be a medical student, did not need to be a proper wife, did not need to fit any mold. She only needed to stand up and sing. And when she raised her voice, something inside her changed. Her singing was no longer held back, no longer bound by rigid rules. It became powerful, raw, and real to the point that even she was surprised. In those moments, she no longer felt herself disappearing. On the contrary, she felt more present than ever before. Each song was not just music, but a way for her to touch the part of herself she had tried to hide for so many years. It was the only place where she did not need to pretend, did not need to fit in, did not need to control every emotion. And that was exactly what made those nights dangerous in their own way. Because once you have known the feeling of being yourself, it becomes very hard to go back to a life where you have to keep hiding your true self. She began to live between two worlds. By day it was responsibilities and predefined roles. By night it was music, freedom, and being herself. And the gap between those two worlds grew wider and wider. Every time she stepped off the stage and returned to her familiar life, she felt a part of herself left behind. No one around her noticed that change, but she knew it very clearly. She knew she could not continue like this forever. It was not a moment of explosion, not a sudden decision. It was a slow process where each passing day made the feeling of not belonging grow a little more. And then came a point when the question was no longer, should I change, but how much longer can I keep living like this? In the silence of choices not yet spoken, one thing became clear: the life she had built was holding her back while at the same time erasing the person she had never had the chance to become. Then came a moment when the distance between the two lives could no longer be endured. Pat Benatar understood that she could no longer stand in the middle. There was no explosive moment, no big argument, no decision made in anger, only a truth that gradually became undeniable. If she stayed, she would continue to disappear. If she left, she might lose everything, and in the end, she chose what few people have the courage to choose. She left the stable life she had built, left a marriage that had once been considered right, and stepped out with nothing but her voice and a fragile belief that it would be enough. The divorce was not loud, but its price was heavier than any words. She did not just leave a husband, but also left an entire safety system, a predictable future, a path accepted by society. Those around her did not understand, or did not want to understand. In their eyes, she was abandoning a stable life to chase something uncertain, a dream that no one could guarantee. There were skeptical looks, unspoken questions, and well-meaning advice laced with doubt. Why trade everything for something so vague? And then, when everything had been cut off, she stood alone before a completely new beginning. No title, no protection, nothing to lean on. There were no big stage lights, no contracts, no one waiting, only small performances, bars where cigarette smoke and noise mixed together, where every night was a test of survival. She sang for people who did not know who she was, for audiences who did not care, for spaces where music was just a small part of the chaos. But it was there that she began to rebuild everything little by little, song by song, night by night. The music industry did not open its doors to welcome her. On the contrary, it tested her in ways she had not prepared for. Demos were sent out and returned in silence. Meetings ended with polite headshakes, comments that sounded like suggestions but were actually rejections. Some said her voice was too strong, not suitable. Some said her image was not what the market was looking for. Some did not even say anything. They simply did not call back. Each time, she had to face the familiar question: am I making a mistake? But if rejection had been enough to stop her, she would not have left her old life in the first place. The issue was not that she was not afraid of failure, but that she had once been afraid of something even bigger, afraid of living a life that was not hers. And that very fear kept pushing her forward, even when every sign around her suggested she should go back. In a world where rock was still defined by men, her stepping in was not just a professional challenge, but a confrontation with long-standing prejudices. She had to prove not only that she could sing, but also that she deserved to stand there in the first place. There were eyes that looked at her as an exception, an experiment, something that did not belong here. There were comments not aimed at her voice but at her as a person. How she looked, how she should change to fit in better. Those pressures did not come all at once, but they accumulated day after day, night after night. There were times when she stood on small stages, looking down at unfamiliar faces, and wondered whether everything she had given up was worth it. Not because she did not believe in her voice, but because the world seemed not yet ready to believe in her. And in moments like that, Loneliness was not just a feeling, but a clear reality. There was no one standing with her in this decision, no one responsible if everything fell apart. But the one thing no one could take away from her was the truth she had touched during those previous singing nights. The feeling of being herself, even if only for a few short minutes, that was the only thing that kept her going. Not the promise of success, not the hope of fame, but the memory of a version of herself she had almost lost. And every time she raised her voice, whether in front of many people or just a few who were not paying attention, she reminded herself that she had come too far to turn back. The road ahead was still unclear, and there was no guarantee it would lead to where she wanted. But one thing had changed. She was no longer the woman standing between two lives. She had chosen, and even if that choice caused her to lose everything, it was the first time in her life that she was truly walking on her own feet. And then, after so many nights on small stages where no one promised anything, a door finally opened for Pat Benatar, not the door of freedom as she had once imagined, but a door leading into a world where everything had its price. When she signed her first recording contract, it was a moment many still call a dream come true. Those who had doubted began to fall silent. Opportunities started to appear, and her name was mentioned for the first time with real attention. But right from the first steps, she also began to realize that the attention was not entirely for her true self, but for the version the industry believed could be sold. Those meetings, those conversations, those suggestions started appearing more densely, and not all of them were related to music. People talked about how she should dress, how she should appear in public, how she should move, even how she should express emotions on stage. No one said outright that she was not good enough, but everything implicitly reminded her that she needed to change to become more suitable. Her voice, the thing that had brought her here, was still kept, but the rest of her was gradually reshaped according to standards she did not choose herself. At first, she accepted those changes as part of the process. She told herself that this was the price to pay to stand on bigger stages, to have her voice heard more widely. But the deeper she went, the more she felt something was not right. The decisions she once thought were hers, choosing songs, how to perform, her public image began to be made by others. They were not wrong. They were just doing their jobs, trying to turn her into a successful artist. But in that process, the boundary between who she was and who she should be gradually became blurred. She stepped onto stages with brighter lights, with larger audiences, with songs that started playing on the radio. Everything seemed to be going in the right direction, but every time she looked in the mirror before performing, there was a very brief moment when she did not fully recognize the woman looking back at her. It was still her, but it was no longer completely her anymore. A part of her had been adjusted, shaped, and optimized to fit what the world wanted to see. The difference between her true self and her public image did not appear immediately, but grew gradually over time. On stage, she was a symbol strong, confident, fearless. In real life, she was still the woman trying to understand who she was becoming. Her real emotions, her doubts, her exhaustion had no place in the image she had to maintain, and so she learned to keep them to herself, learned to smile when needed, learned to stand firm when all eyes were on her. The pressure did not come from one side, but from all sides at once. Audiences expected her to always be outstanding. The record label expected her to continue succeeding. The media expected her to maintain her image. There was no space for mistakes, no time to stop. Each success was not an ending point, but a starting point for even greater expectations. And in that whirlwind, she not only had to sing better, but also had to become a bigger, stronger, more perfect version of herself. There were times she wondered if this was what she had been looking for from the beginning. She had left a stable life to be herself, but now, in a very different way, she was once again adjusting herself to fit into another system. The only difference was that this time the lights were brighter, the applause was louder, and the price was higher. But the familiar feeling was still there, the feeling of having to hide a part of herself to survive. And the hardest thing was not the external changes, but accepting them without completely losing herself. Each time she agreed with a decision she did not fully believe in, each time she stepped on stage with a pre-prepared image, she felt she was getting closer to a version she was not sure she wanted to become. But at the same time, she also knew that if she refused everything, she might lose the opportunity she had sacrificed so much to get. So she continued walking that path, not completely the person she once was, but also not completely losing herself. Between the songs, the performances, the decisions made in closed meeting rooms, she kept one thing that no one could change: the way she sang when she truly felt the music. That was the place where no one could control, where her voice still belonged to her, no matter how much everything around her changed. And that, though small, was still enough to keep her standing firm in a world that was trying to reshape her every day. And then, when everything seemed to be on the right track that the world called success, Pat Benatar entered the period where her voice no longer belonged to small stages anymore, but rang out across radio, stations, charts, and in the memories of millions of people. Songs like Heartbreaker, Hit Me With Your Best Shot, Love Is a Battlefield not only became hits, they became the voice of a generation looking for strength in their own wounds. Her voice carried an energy that could not be faked, a straightforwardness that many had never heard from a woman in rock. And that was exactly what made her a symbol not only of music, but of an image of a woman who did not bow down, did not ask for permission, did not wait to be accepted. Audiences loved her for that strength. The media called her a symbol of feminism in music. Her images appeared on MTV, on magazine covers, in interviews where she was asked about strength, about independence, about being a woman in a world that was not built for her. But behind all that praise, there was a truth rarely mentioned. To maintain that image, she had no choice but to continue being strong, even when she no longer had enough strength. The performance schedule began to thicken to the point where there was no space left. One city followed another, one stage replaced another, and every night she had to step out with the same energy, the same voice, the same image that the audience expected. There was no concept of not good enough today, no space for exhaustion, no room to stop. Long flights, unfamiliar hotels, endless rehearsals, all became a loop she could not escape. Her body started speaking up before she could admit it. Her voice, the thing that had brought her here, began to feel the pressure from its own success. Those continuous nights of singing, those non-stop performances made every note become a greater effort than before. But she could not stop, because stopping was not just resting. Stopping could mean being replaced, being forgotten, being left behind in an industry that waited for no one. Her spirit was no longer intact as before. There were times she stepped on stage and felt like she was replaying a version of herself, a version that the audience loved, but not always reflecting the true person inside. The applause still rang out, the lights still shone, but amid all of that, she began to feel a growing gap between what she showed and what she truly felt. Not because she did not love music, but because she no longer had time to feel it like before. There were nights, after leaving the stage, when everything had become quiet. She sat alone in the hotel room and tried to remember the feeling when music used to be a refuge, not an obligation. But those moments became rarer, overshadowed by the schedule, by responsibilities, by expectations that never stop. She no longer sang just for herself. She sang for the audience, for the record label, for the image she had built, and for everything that depended on her continuing. And the hardest thing was not the physical fatigue, but not having the right to acknowledge it. As a symbol of strength, she was not allowed to appear weak. As a model of resilience, she was not allowed to stop. The things the world loved about her, the strength, the toughness, were exactly what made her unable to allow herself to rest. Every time she felt tired, she reminded herself that this was what she had chosen. But deep inside, A part of her started to wonder whether she was paying too high a price for being loved. Success, the thing she once thought would bring freedom, now became another form of constraint. Not constraint by others, but by the very expectations she had helped create. She not only had to live with her success, but also had to maintain it, protect it, and never let it decline. And in that process, the time to simply exist, to rest, to not become anyone, almost disappeared. But no matter how tired she was, she still stepped onto the stage every night, not because she had no choice anymore, but because one thing remained intact: the connection between her and the people listening. When she sang, even in a brief moment, everything became clear again. The original reasons, the real emotions, all came back, even if only fleetingly. And those moments, though rare, were still enough to keep her going. The world loved her, honored her, and kept calling her name as a symbol. But amid all of that, there was a truth that few realized: she had never really had time to stop and feel it all. And the more she was loved, the more she had to continue, not because she did not want to rest, but because she did not know how to stop without losing everything she had built. Then there came a time when the tours were no longer journeys of conquest, but became an endless loop. The stage, where it had once been Pat Benatar's only escape, began to take on a different meaning. It was no longer the place where she found herself, but the place she was forced to return to night after night, as if everything she had built depended on her not being allowed to stop. Cities changed, audiences changed, lights changed, but the feeling inside gradually became the same. A feeling so familiar it was frightening. When everything around kept moving while she was held in the same role. Her life now was no longer measured by personal moments, but by the performance schedule, by flight hours, by the nights she had to appear on time, in the right place, with the right image. There were no more mornings that truly belonged to her, no more evenings that ended in complete quiet. Everything was divided into short time slots, just enough to rest, but not enough to recover. And in that rhythm, her body began sending signals she could no longer ignore. Her voice, which had once been her greatest source of strength, now also had to bear the weight of its own success. The high notes no longer came as easily as before. The continuous performances put prolonged pressure on every vocal cord. There were nights she clearly felt the fatigue in every breath, in every line she sang. But when she stepped out in front of the audience, no one could see it. To them, she was still the strong woman, still the irreplaceable voice. And that belief made her unable to allow herself to weaken, even a little. The exhaustion was not only in her body, but also crept into her spirit in a way that was harder to notice. When every night was the same, when every song was repeated in the same way, the boundary between performing and existing began to blur. She was no longer sure if she was living her own life or just performing a role that stretched across many years. The words, the gestures, even the emotions seemed to repeat according to a pattern that had been shaped long before. There were times she wondered, where did her true self still exist in all of this? When standing on stage, she was the person the whole world recognized. But when she left the lights, when the applause stopped, she had to take time to remember who she was, if not that image. And that time grew longer and longer, as if her true self was gradually being pushed back, making way for a version built to exist in public. The feeling of being trapped did not come from one specific place, but from the inescapable repetition itself. The stage was no longer a choice, but an obligation. Not because she no longer loved music, but because she was no longer free to experience it the way she wanted. Every performance had to meet a certain standard. Every song had to deliver the emotion the audience expected. There was no space for change, no room for experimentation, no opportunity to simply sing for herself. And that was exactly what made the place that had once been the freest become the place where she felt most constrained. The stage had once been where she could escape all frameworks, where she could shout out emotions that no one could control. But now it was the place where she had to keep everything within limits, had to ensure everything went exactly as expected. Freedom had been replaced by responsibility, and real emotions had to give way to stability. There were nights, amid the music and the lights, when she still felt a familiar spark, a very brief moment when she forgot all the pressure, when her voice returned to its original meaning. But those moments became rarer, covered by the demands, the plans, the things that had been arranged in advance. And when they passed, she returned to reality, a reality where stopping was not an easy choice. She had once left a life to find freedom, and now, in a very different way, she was facing a new constraint, not constrained by others, but by the very image she had created, by the very success she had achieved. And the hardest thing was not stepping onto the stage every night, but continuing to do so without completely losing the part of herself that had made her start. The stage remained bright, the music still played, and the audience still stood there, waiting for her as they always had. But inside, something had changed. Not a collapse, but a silent shift, where the freedom that once existed now had to share space with responsibility, with expectations, and with a question she had never had time to answer. If there was no more stage, would she still know how to live as herself? Amid the hectic pace of the tours and the non-stop pressure from the stage, the appearance of Neil Giraldo in Pat Benatar's life at first felt like a rare moment of calm, a place where she did not need to perform, did not need to maintain an image, did not need to strain to become a symbol. They met not in a staged, fateful moment, but in the very music world that was wearing her down every day. He was a musician, someone who understood the structure of sound, who understood how a song was built from the smallest details, and more importantly, he listened, not to her polished voice, but to the person behind it. Their collaboration began with music, but quickly became an inseparable bond. Neil did not try to change her the way the industry had, but helped her dig deeper into what she already had. Their working sessions were not just composing or recording, but conversations where she could say things she had never had the chance to say before. And in that space, her music changed. It became sharper, truer, carrying more emotion. The songs they created together were not only commercially successful, but also defined a distinct sound, a signature that the public could recognize immediately. Success came quickly and clearly. Songs topped the charts. Bigger performances, larger audiences, all were proof of the power of this combination. Their names began to be mentioned together, not just as two individuals, but as a creative unit. For her, that was both a relief and a change she had not fully understood. For the first time, she did not have to face the world alone. But at the same time, for the first time, her success was no longer completely hers alone. Voices from outside began to appear, at first small, then gradually clearer. There were people questioning her role in that success. There were comments suggesting Neil was the one behind it, the one creating the sound, the one shaping the direction. Those words were not always direct, but enough to create a quiet, pressure, a feeling that she needed to prove something, not only to the audience, but to those watching every step she took. She did not deny Neil's role because she knew clearly what he brought, but at the same time, she also felt a shift that was hard to name when the boundary between support and dependence became blurred. In music, they understood each other almost without words. In life, they relied on each other in a way she had never experienced before. And that deep connection made everything more complicated, because when two people merged too tightly, the question of who was who began to become hard to answer. There were times she stood on stage, singing the songs they had created together, and clearly felt the power of that connection. But there were also times when the lights went out. She wondered whether that voice, that path, was still completely hers or not. Not because she lost herself, but because she was sharing it in a way she had never done before. The dependence did not come suddenly, but formed over time through decisions made together, through moments when one person became the support for the other. In work, she trusted him. In life, she relied on him. And that brought the stability she had lacked throughout the years before. But along with that stability came a question she could not completely avoid: whether she could stand firm alone. If one day everything changed, their love was not something that weakened her, but something that helped her survive in a world that kept demanding. But precisely because of that, it also became an inseparable part of the person she was becoming. Her music, her life, her choices all carried the mark of that combination, and while the world looked at them as a successful couple, as a perfect harmony, inside, she was still trying to keep some part that belonged only to her. She did not return to her old life, did not return to the person she had been before it all began. But now, amid success, amid love, amid deep connection, she faced another kind of question. Not where she should go, but how much of herself remained in the journey she had chosen. And as the music continued to play, as the audience continued to call her name, that question did not disappear. It only quietly accompanied her through every song, every stage, every passing year. And then, when everything finally reached the point that people called the peak, Pat Benatar stood where very few had ever reached a position built from millions of records, packed stages, and a string of achievements that made her name an irreplaceable symbol. Prestigious awards were given one after another. Her songs not only topped the charts, but also became part of the collective memory of America. She was no longer a voice trying to find her place. She had become the standard, the model, the name others had to compare to. And in the eyes of the world, that was the moment of complete victory. But right at the place where everything seemed most perfect, a different feeling began to creep in, a feeling that was not loud, not clear, but deep enough that she could not ignore it. She still stood on stage, still sang the songs that had made her name, still received applause as if nothing had changed. But inside, a distance began to form between the person she once was and the image she was carrying, not because she no longer loved music, but because she was no longer sure she was singing for the same reasons as before. Each new success did not bring relief, but carried greater pressure. When you were already at the peak, everything ahead was no longer a journey upward, but a nonstop effort not to fall. The next songs had to be better, the performances had to be bigger, the image had to be stronger. There was no room to slow down, no space to find herself again. And in that whirlwind, she began to feel she was no longer leading her own life. She was running after a pace that her own success had created. The awards, the praises, the titles, all were the recognition she had once longed for. But now, they no longer brought the same feeling as before. They became milestones she had to maintain, proofs she had to protect. Every time she stepped on stage to receive an award, she smiled, said thank you. But deep inside, a part of her wondered if that was still something she truly needed, not because those achievements had no value, but because the price to keep them grew larger and larger. The pressure came not only from outside, but also from the way she saw herself. When the whole world had gotten used to a certain image, changing became almost impossible. She not only had to succeed, she had to continue being the version everyone loved. That meant every step had to be careful, every decision had to be weighed, every change had to be controlled. And in that process, the real, human part, the imperfect part, the part still surging gradually, got pushed to the back. There were very small moments when she was not in front of the audience, when there were no cameras, when no one was waiting. She clearly felt that strangeness, as if she was living in a version of herself that she had built but did not fully belong to. Real emotions became harder to name because they did not fit the image she needed to maintain. And so she continued doing what she had learned very early, keeping them inside, not letting anyone see. The contradiction between success and personal emotions was not always clear, but it was present in every decision. When she chose a song, it was not only an artistic choice, but also a strategic one. When she appeared in public, it was not only presence, but part of a larger image she had to protect. And in all of that, the question of what she really wanted began to fade. She did not lose everything in one moment. There was no clear collapse to mark the change. Instead, she began to lose small parts of herself, little by little, over time. One decision here, one compromise there, one time putting others' expectations above her own feelings, all accumulated, not big enough to notice immediately, but enough to create a void she did not know how to fill. And what made it harder was that no one around her saw it. To them, she was at her peak. She had everything an artist could want. There was no reason to doubt, no sign that something was wrong, and that very perfection made it even harder for her to say what she was feeling. Because how could you explain that you felt lost when the whole world believed you had arrived at the right place? She continued to move forward, continued to sing, continued to hold the image she had built, not because she did not want to change, but because she did not know if she could change without losing everything. And in that silence, one truth gradually became clear. Sometimes the peak is not where you find yourself, but where you begin to wonder how far you have gone without realizing you are moving away from your true self. And then, at the peak that everyone thought could not be given up, Pat Benatar stood before a choice that no award could help her decide. It was not a choice between success and failure, but between two lives, one life that had taken her to the peak, and one life she had never really given herself the chance to live fully. When everything around was still moving at a dizzying speed, when her name was still mentioned as a standard, she began to feel clearly one very simple thing that could not be ignored. She could not continue living only as an image. That decision did not come in a burst of emotion, but formed through the rare moments of silence between the dense schedule, to the nights when she no longer had enough energy to convince herself that everything was fine. She began to think about the things she had always set aside before family, time, relationships, not related to the stage or music, not because she did not care, but because she had never given herself the chance to prioritize them. But now, when she had everything the world called success, she realized there were things that could not be achieved by fame or applause. When she and Neil Giraldo built a life together, the question was no longer how to succeed more, but how to live differently. Becoming a mother was not a pre-calculated plan, but a turning point that made everything have to be looked at again. When the children appeared in her life, the familiar rhythm began to change. It was no longer just a performance schedule, no longer just a recording sessions, but mornings at home. Small moments she had never experienced fully before, but that very change brought with it a series of choices that no one could make for her. Every performance invitation, every new project, every opportunity that appeared, all had to be considered in a different way. Not whether it would help her succeed more, but how much time it would take away from what she could spend with her family. And for the first time, she began to say no to things she had once tried to grab at any cost. Those refusals were never easy. Every opportunity passed up carried a question, whether she was giving up too much. In an industry that waited for no one, slowing down was almost the same as accepting being replaced. There were people who did not understand her choices. There were people who thought she was losing the position she had worked so hard to achieve, and sometimes even she was not completely sure she was heading in the right direction. There were nights when everything became quiet. She wondered what would happen if she chose differently, if she kept chasing her career, kept taking advantage of the peak, kept putting music above everything. Could she achieve even more? And if the answer was yes, what did that mean for what she was choosing in the present? There was no clear answer, only a vague feeling that every choice carried a certain loss. But at the same time, there were moments that no stage could replace, moments when she realized that life was not only measured by what others saw, when she was at home, when there were no lights, when there was no applause. She began to experience a different kind of meaning, quieter, more private, but also truer. And it was in those moments that the way she viewed success began to change. Success was no longer about topping the charts, no longer about the number of awards, no longer about how often she was mentioned. It became something harder to define, whether she was living a life she truly wanted or not. But even as she began to understand that, the uncertainty did not disappear, because there was no way to know for sure that she had chosen correctly, no way to see the path she had not taken. She did not abandon music, nor did she completely turn her back on the stage, but she changed the way she existed in it. She no longer let it define her entire self, no longer let it decide every choice, and in that process, she had to learn to accept that she would no longer be in the position she once held, that the world would continue to move without waiting for her, that what she had built might not keep its original shape. It was not a collapse, but a shift from a life defined by success to a life defined by choice. But what made it difficult was that there was no clear ending point, no moment when she could be certain she had done the right thing. Only time, and what she felt with each passing day. And in all of that, there was one truth she gradually accepted, that there was no path that allowed her to keep everything. Every decision carried a price, and sometimes the hardest thing was not choosing, but living with that choice when you knew there were things you would never be able to get back. And then, when the choices had been made and the pace of life began to slow down in the way she once thought she needed, Pat Benatar gradually realized a truth that no one had prepared her for. The world did not stop while she was learning to live a different life, a life that did not revolve around the stage and the lights. The music industry continued to move forward at its familiar speed. New sounds appeared, new trends formed, and new names began to take up the space that had once belonged to her. Music changed, not only in melody but also in the way it was created, promoted, and consumed. The new generation of artists stepped onto the stage with different energy, different style, and a completely new approach to the audience. They did not carry the pressures she had once faced, but they also did not carry the old constraints. They were freer in the way their era allowed, and that made the difference clearer than ever. It was not that she no longer fit, but that the world around her had changed in a direction where she was no longer the center. The charts she once dominated now carried different names. The big stages she had once been familiar with began to be filled by new faces. And the media, which always chased what was new, gradually shifted its attention to other stories. There was no specific moment that marks this change, no official announcement that said she had been replaced. Everything happened slowly, almost imperceptible, unless looking back, until she realized she no longer appeared in the places that had once been obvious. Her presence in the media decreased, not because she disappeared completely, but because she was no longer the story people wanted to tell. Interviews became fewer, invitations no longer came as thick as before, and in that gap, there was a feeling that was very hard to name, not failure, not regret, but a quiet realization that she no longer stood in the position she once had. There were times she turned on the radio and heard new voices, new songs, and realized that music was still continuing, still reaching other people in the way she once had. That did not hurt her in a clear way, but it reminded her of one thing, that every era had its own people, and no one could hold a position forever in a world that was always changing. The feeling of being left behind did not come as a shock, but like a slow wave. It appeared in small moments, when she realized her name was no longer mentioned in conversations about the present, when she saw the stages she once stood on now belonged to others, when she understood that what she once was no longer defined what was happening. And what made it hard to accept was not that change itself, but the fact that she could do nothing to stop it. But at the same time, a part of her also understood that this was inevitable. She had once been the new once stepped into a world where those who came before had to make way. And now, that circle continued, not because anyone was wrong, but because that was how everything always happened. However, understanding that did not mean the emotions became easier, because when you had once been the center, stepping out of that position, whether voluntarily or not, still carried a void that nothing could completely fill. The silence gradually replaced the spotlight. There were no more thundering applause every night, no more lights illuminating every step, no more feeling that the whole world was listening. Instead, there were quieter days, more private spaces, where she did not need to be anyone but herself. And in that silence, she began to face another question. When no longer defined by the spotlight, who was she? That was not an easy question to answer, and it was not a question with a single answer, but it was a question she could not avoid. Because if before she had to learn how to exist in the light, now she had to learn how to exist in its absence, not disappearing, but existing in a different way, a way that did not need constant recognition from the outside. She was not completely forgotten, not erased from history, not losing what she had achieved. But she was also no longer the center of the present, and between those two states, she had to find a way to continue not by returning to the old position, but by accepting that that position had changed. That did not diminish the value of what she had done, but it changed the way she saw herself. And in that change, there was a very specific kind of loneliness, not loneliness, because there was no one around, but loneliness because she was no longer seen in the way she had once been seen. But it was also in that loneliness that she began to understand there were parts of life that did not need lights to exist. They were not loud, not widely recorded, but they were real, and sometimes that very truth was what she had been searching for a long time, even without realizing it. And as the spotlight gradually receded into the background, as the world no longer called her name with the same frequency as before, Pat Benatar entered a phase that no charts recorded, no awards honored, but it occupied the deepest years of her life. It was the life of a mother, a wife, a person no longer illuminated by stage lights, but existing in small, private spaces, where every value had to be felt with the heart, not by external recognition. Her days were no longer measured by the number of audience members or the size of the stage, but by very ordinary things. Breakfast prepared in a hurry, taking the kids to school, evening sitting beside them as they slept. There was no applause, no lights, no one capturing those moments to put on magazine covers. But it was in those small things that she began to live a life she had never had the chance to experience fully before. There were mornings she woke up not to prepare for a performance, but to start a day like everyone else. There was no preparation for an image, no dense schedule, only repeated tasks that carried a different meaning, a meaning she could not find on any stage. And in those moments, she realized there was another kind of presence, another kind of existence that did not need to prove anything, did not need to be seen to have value. But those years were not always easy. The sacrifice never appeared with a clear shape. There was no moment she could point to and say, "This is when I gave up." Instead, it was present in very small decisions. A show declined, a trip not taken, an opportunity set aside. Each time like that, she had to remind herself of the reason she had chosen this path. But that did not make the feeling of regret disappear completely. There were times when she listened to old songs again, when she saw images of herself on stage from many years before. A part of her still remembered very clearly that feeling. The feeling of standing in front of thousands of people, hearing the applause ring out, knowing she was at the center of a moment that nothing could replace. And in those moments, she could not deny that a part of her still longed to go back, even if only in thought. But then, those sounds gradually gave way to more familiar calls. The voices of her children, simple questions, needs that could not be postponed. And in that transition, she learned to balance between two worlds, one world she had built with her whole life and one world she was building day by day. She did not always do it perfectly. There were days she felt she was not enough for both. There were times she wondered if she could have done better if she had chosen differently. But what made these years special was not perfection, but presence. For the first time, she did not need to share herself with the whole world. What she did not need to be witnessed, did not need to be judged. And in that silence, she began to understand that there were things that could only be felt when no one was looking. Happiness and regret did not exist separately, but intertwined with each other in every day. There were moments she felt complete, in a way the stage could not bring, when she saw her children grow up, when she knew she had been there, not as an image, but as a real person. But there were also times when everything became quiet. When no one needed her in a particular moment, she faced the old questions again. Whether she had given up too much, whether there was some part of life she would never get back. There were no definitive answers to those questions. Only time and the way she chose to live with what she had chosen. And in the years that no one saw, no one recorded, she continued to build a different kind of strength, not loud, not brilliant, but enduring in a way that only those who had to make choices could understand. The world might no longer follow her every step as before, but that did not mean what she did lost its value. It was just that the value no longer lay where others could see it easily. It lay in the small moments, in the repeated choices, in the years she had devoted to things that were never brought to the stage. And it was in those years that she did not become less, she only became a different version of herself. A version that did not need lights to exist, but carried a depth that lights had never been able to reach. And then, when the quiet years had passed long enough for everything to gradually settle, Pat Benatar began to face a kind of change that no one could avoid. Time. It was no longer pressure from the industry, no longer comparison with other artists, but a slow shift from within, where her body and voice no longer responded in the way she had been familiar with for decades. The high notes that once rang out naturally now required more effort. Performances demanded more preparation, and rest became more necessary than ever. There was no specific moment that marked this change, only a day when she realized she could not sing like before without paying a price. But unlike previous phases, this time she did not resist. There was no effort to return to the old version, no attempt to prove she was still the same. Instead, she began to listen not only to the music, but to her own body. The signs she had once ignored now became something she had to respect. And in that acceptance, there was a kind of peace she had never had in the years chasing the lights. The change was not only in her voice, but also in the way she viewed performing. The stage was no longer a place she had to conquer, but a place she chose to appear when she felt ready. Long tours became fewer, performances more selective, not because she no longer had the ability, but because she no longer needed to prove it. And in that choice, she began to find again a part of the freedom she had lost long ago, the right to decide when she would step up and when she would stop. There were people who tried to cling to the old image, tried to maintain a version of themselves that time had changed. But she did not follow that path. She did not try to become the woman who had once stood on big stages with inexhaustible energy. She did not try to hide the change, did not try to make it disappear. Instead, she let it exist as a part of the journey she could not separate from. That did not mean she did not feel the loss. There were moments when she listened to old recordings again, when she remembered the feeling of standing in front of thousands of people with a powerful, limitless voice. She still felt a very light sadness, not intense regret, but a clear awareness that there were things that could not come back. But that sadness did not stop her, but only made her understand more deeply what she had had and what she had been through. Her life now was no longer defined by speed, but by rhythm. The days passed more slowly, Not because there was nothing to do, but because she no longer needed to fill every empty space. She observed more, listened more, and spent time on things she had not had the chance to notice before. Small details, the morning light, the quiet of an afternoon. Conversations without purpose began to carry a different meaning, no longer under pressure to always appear, no longer required to always be at the center. She learned to exist without needing to be seen continuously. That was not easy at first, because for a long time her presence had been tied to being recognized. But gradually she realized there was another form of existence, one that did not depend on lights, did not need applause to confirm it. And in that silence, she began to look back at her life in a different way, not as a series of achievements, not as a journey that needed to be evaluated, but as a story she had lived fully, in the only way she could. The decisions she had once doubted, the choices she had once been uncertain about, now no longer needed to be explained. They were simply parts of a life she had gone through. She no longer tried to hold on to everything, no longer tried to become everything she had once been. Instead, she chose to keep what still had meaning: music, family, moments when she could truly be present. And in that selection, she did not become less, but became clearer. Time did not take away everything, but it changed the way everything existed. And when she accepted that, not as a surrender, but as a natural part of the journey, she found a different kind of strength. Not the strength to conquer, but the strength to let go of what no longer belonged to her. And perhaps, for the first time in many years, she no longer needed to chase after anything. And when everything had slowed down enough for memories to return clearly, Pat Benatar began to look back at her life not as a series of separate events, but as a map of choices, each turn leading to a different path, each decision carrying a possibility she had not taken. No longer under pressure to move forward, no longer needing to prove anything to the world, she had time to ask the questions she had always postponed before. Not to change the past, but to understand it more clearly. There were times she thought about the path she had left, very early: the stable life, the medical field, a future without stages, without lights, without long tours across many cities, a life that might have been simpler, with fewer ups and downs, and perhaps less painful in some way. She imagined a version of herself living in that stability, a woman who did not have to face the pressure of fame, who did not have to share herself with millions of strangers. And in that thought, there was a fleeting sense of peace, as if there was a path she could have taken, where everything was gentler. But then, right after that, she also realized that path would never have brought what she had experienced. No music in the way she had felt it, no moments when her voice touched others, no experiences that had shaped the person she was. Every path carried its own kind of loss, and no path allowed her to keep everything. She also thought about the choices she had made at the peak of her career, the time she said no when the world expected her to say yes, the opportunities she had turned down, the stages she had not stepped onto, the songs she had not sung. There were moments when she wondered what would have happened if she had chosen differently, whether she could have extended her time at the peak, whether her name would still be mentioned more, whether she could have become something bigger in the eyes of the world. But at the same time, she also remembered what those choices had brought. The years with her family, the moments that no one but her could experience, the things that no award could replace. And in that comparison, there was no side that completely won or lost, only different things she had chosen to keep. Facing what had been missed was not an easy process. There were days she felt she had let slip opportunities that could not come back. There were times she wondered if she could have done better if she had known what would happen. But then she also understood that there was no way to live a life without missing something. Every decision was a refusal of other possibilities, and no one could walk all paths at once. What changed was not the past, but the way she looked at it. Instead of seeing what she did not have as a lack, she began to look at what she did have as part of the whole. Not perfect, not complete in every sense, but real. A life not built from absolutely correct choices, but from choices she had been willing to live with. She no longer tried to search for a better version of her life and possibilities that had not happened, because she knew that even if she had the chance to do it over, she would still face similar choices between career and family, between success and presence, between being seen and living truthfully. And none of those choices was easy. Acceptance did not come as a decision, but as a process. It did not erase the questions, did not make the thoughts about what if disappear, but it made them lighter, no longer things that needed to be resolved, but parts of a story that had been completed. And when she looked back, not with the eyes of judgment, but with deeper understanding, she realized that her life did not need to be perfect to have meaning. It only needed to be lived fully in the way she could, with all its limitations, its mistakes, its choices that no one could make for her. There might be other paths, other lives that she had not lived, but that was not what made this life feel lacking. On the contrary, it was precisely the fact that she could not have everything that made what she kept more vivid. And in that clarity, she no longer searched for a final answer. She simply continued to live with what she had as an inseparable part of herself. And when everything that had passed settled into memory, Pat Benatar no longer saw her life as a series of peaks and empty spaces, but as a long journey where each phase left an indelible mark. From a young girl growing up in a tight framework, learning to hide her true self to become proper, to the woman who dared to leave everything behind to pursue a voice that no one guaranteed would be heard, then becoming an icon that the whole world had to acknowledge. All of it was not a straight path, but winding roads where every decision carried a portion of loss. The achievements she attained were not only in numbers or awards, though they remained as undeniable milestones. Her songs had become part of popular culture, not because they were technically perfect, but because they touched on things that people do not easily say. Her voice did not just tell her own story, but became the voice for those seeking strength in their own fragility. And that was a form of success that not everyone could achieve. A presence that extended through time, not only in music, but in the way people felt about it. But beside what the world saw, there was another part of the journey that was never fully recorded. The choices she had made, leaving stability, accepting uncertainty, stepping into an industry not built for her, had shaped the person she became, but also took away things that no one could return. The years she gave to the stage were years she could not fully give to other things. The moments she refused opportunities to be with family were moments when her career changed direction. None of those choices were easy, and none of them were completely right. She did not collapse in the way people often tell about tragic lives. There was no single moment when everything fell apart, no fall that she could not stand up from. But that did not mean she did not pay a price. On the contrary, her price was paid gradually, over time in the parts of herself that she had to adjust, in the paths she could not return to, in the moment she realized she had gone too far to go back to the starting point. And yet, she still continued to walk. Not at the pace of the peak years, not with the pressure to prove anything, but with a different kind of persistence. A persistence that did not need to be loud. She no longer tried to be an icon, no longer tried to hold on to the image the world had grown familiar with. Instead, she existed in the way she could, with what remained, with what still mattered. Her image now did not lie on big stages, but in continuing to sing while she still could, continuing to live in the way she had chosen, continuing to keep the parts of herself that no one could take away. The world might no longer follow her every step as before, but that did not diminish the value of what she had done. Because legacy is not about being seen continuously, but about what you created still existing when the lights go out. For later generations, her story was not only about music, but about choice. Not right or wrong choices, but choices that you were willing to live with. She did not have a perfect life. She did not have a journey without stumbles, but she had something that not everyone could: keep honesty with herself, even when that meant having to pay the price. And perhaps that was what made her story still meaningful. Not because she had never fallen, but because she had never stopped walking, even when the road ahead was no longer as clear as before. She could not keep everything, but she kept enough to continue. And in a world that always demanded more, sometimes simply still standing there, not perfect, not complete, but still real, was the hardest thing to do. Looking back at Pat Benatar's entire journey, what made people ache was not a single major event, but the way life quietly took away pieces of her that no one truly noticed. From the young girl growing up in a framework, having to hide herself to become perfect, to the woman who dared to leave everything behind: her marriage, the stable path to pursue music. She began her journey with a very clear trade-off. But the most painful paradox lay in this: when she finally reached the peak with hits like Love is a Battlefield, won multiple Grammy Awards, and became a feminist icon in rock, that very success continued to shape and suffocate her true self. Details like having to tour nonstop, feeling alienated from herself when looking in the mirror, or being forced to maintain a strong image even when exhausted inside, showed a very American truth: success does not always bring freedom. Her decisions later on, refusing opportunities to choose family, accepting being left behind by the world, and living in years no one saw, were proof of another kind of courage, less celebrated but much more profound. For the American people, this story was not just about a rock star, but a reminder that the American dream always comes with its price. You can achieve everything, but you cannot keep everything. And sometimes real strength does not lie in rising to the top, but in knowing when to stop, when to choose again, and in accepting to live with what you have traded. If Pat Benatar's story made you think about the things we have to trade in life, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way to appreciate that quiet journey. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore lives that are not perfect but full of meaning.